Well, good morning, and good morning to Sunday mornings at the Marxist Library. Except we're not at the Marxist Library due to the pandemic, but we still support the important work of the Marxist Library as a community and intellectual resource. We are the Institute for Critical Study of Society, ICSS, and we've been doing these webinars for about a decade and a half. They're weekly webinars or weekly presentations. They used to be in person, but of course now we do it digitally. And we have consciously, I hope successfully, cultivated a culture of mutual respect and understanding of various issues, because we don't always agree, but this is a forum for us to discuss those issues. We are in a way united in our respect for the work of Karl Marx, and we believe his work remains relevant today. And particularly, we look to the 11th thesis of Karl Marx, 11th thesis on Feuerbach. His lifelong comrade, Friedrich Engels, chose at the epitaph for Marx's grave. Marx died in 1883 at the age of 65, and Engels had his headstone say, quote, the philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it. And in keeping with that theme, our speaker is a long-term political activist. Stan Smith has been active for some 40 years. He's mainly active in the Latin American solidarity movement. He was instrumental in the Free the Cuban Five campaign, the five Cuban heroes in the Chicago area where he hails, and he writes extensively. He's one of the important thinkers right now in that movement, and he publishes a weekly compendium of critical articles related to Venezuela called the Alba Weekly, and other countries in Latin America and related topics. You can get that by subscribing directly to him to get that compendium of articles, or it is posted weekly on the website of the Alliance for Global Justice. And with that said, I'll turn over the program to Stan. He will give about a 50-minute presentation, and during that time, you'll be muted. But when he finishes, we'll have a short announcement, and then we'll have a robust Q&A. And at that time, everybody will have an opportunity to ask a question and have Stan respond, or actually you can make comments as well as questions. So I want to give a very warm welcome to Stan Smith from the Windy City. Stan, it's all yours.
Well, thanks for having me here, and thanks for inviting me to speak about these two articles I wrote. They're both on that blog I have, Chicago Alba Solidarity WordPress.com, which I wrote them because people had asked me about modern monetary theory and what did I think of it, which I always thought, well, it's something's wrong with it, but I don't really know what's wrong with it. So I figured I'd start studying it more and learn about it. And also because we know that the US is printing trillions and trillions of dollars, but the inflation rate doesn't go up. So why is that happening? I mean, modern monetary theory tries to give an explanation, but I wanted to look at, what was going on. So I wrote these two articles about, first one was more on modern monetary theory and what it was missing. And the second one was about why the US is able to print trillions of dollars and not suffer from inflation. So the talk I give, I'll give a summary of these two articles. And if you wanted to read them more, they're on that website, which has a lot of the references, which I'm not going to give here. Um, if if none of you are that interested in modern monetary theory, I won't really need to explain it just very much. I'll just say it says if you have a currency that is sovereign, that means you're in charge of printing the currency, then you can print as much as you want and you don't have to worry about inflation until your economy is at full employment and full use of all the resources in the country. And if you keep printing money after that point, then inflation will result. Um, well, I won't really go into modern monetary theory that much outside of saying that. The problem with this theory is that it is basically true for the United States, and that's about it. Because we've seen in the United States, the national debt is now what, about $26 trillion? I think the world national debt of all the countries in the world is like 44 trillion. So half of the world national debts of countries is in the United States. And it's not just, I mean, even in my article, I say even people like Alan Greenspan say the United States can pay any amount of debt it has because we can always print money to do that. So there's zero probability of default on the dollar and on the debt. I go over, well, I won't, if you wanted to look at my first article, I go over what the conditions are to have a sovereign currency. And you look at all you have to produce your own currency, which includes all the Euro countries because they don't make their own currency. They use a shared currency. You'd have like Japan, Canada, Australia, United States, and a lot of other third world countries make their own currency. Another condition is that they buy and have make loans on the international market and buy and sell goods on the international market in their own currency. And when you get down to it, as I'll get into in a minute, the only country that really does that is the United States. And the reason the United States can do that is because the US dollar is the international reserve currency. It's the world currency. Now, I'll just go into some when I was looking into this, the role that we find that the dollar plays in world trade, which I think is underestimated by people who think, well, the U.S. is declining, and so its role is not what it used to be. But that's not the case. I mean, it's only the case that it's not the what did Marx say? The warehouse of the world, workhouse of the production. It's not the center of production in the world anymore. There's more production going on in China. um, but outside of that, it's still on top. Um, for example, foreign nations all need to use dollars to conduct their international trade. It doesn't matter what country that is. It's China, Russia, Euro countries, Latin America. They don't trade with each other in their own currencies. They all use the dollar. And strange as it may seem, whenever the US goes into some economic crisis like in 2008, 2009, other countries do not get off the dollar. They invest more in the dollar because it's always still considered the safest currency in the world. So it's a rather strange thing that the 2008, 2009 economic crisis happened in the United States and other countries suffered for it. But the way they stabilized their currency and tried to protect themselves was by investing more in the US dollar. And it's like, wow, you have a situation like that, is that countries invest in the dollar, and then when the dollar is unstable, they do it more. It's like it's going to create quite a problem about how there's going to be some other currency that's going to replace the dollar. Um, Now, even with China, which is said to be surpassing the US in terms of economic development, which I guess it is if they use production parity measure, it's uh, much more developed in the United States. But they now make 12.4% of world trade as of 2018. And the US makes 11.5% of world trade as of 2018. But China is still way behind the US, and what currency do they use in international payments for their world trade? Well, it's only 2% of international payments are made in the Chinese RMB. While the United States, it's over, I think it's about 60% of all world trade takes place in the US dollar. So even though the US is declining in production, it still rules international trade through it, everything taking place through the dollar, which is one thing that shows how US sanctions on another country can just destroy it, because it's all like all international trade, or most of it goes through the US banking system and dollar system. And until there's something set up that goes around it, then countries like Iran or Venezuela, they're really kind of stuck. Um, Another thing that shows the power of the dollar, besides that it's the most common currency used in international trade, is that most foreign bank reserves are in the dollar. They don't hold their country's reserves in their own money. They hold their country reserves in the US dollar. 60% of the reserves of foreign countries' central banks are in the US dollar. That's way more than any other rest of the world put together. That's today still. And the third thing about the role of the dollar is that almost 2/3 of international debt held out of the United States must be paid for in dollars. So the dollar is required for international trade, for paying international debt, for making international loans. And it's really is not affected by the decline in the role of US production in the world market. Another thing is like foreign trading,
Stan, we lost your sound.
Your sound.
You're not muted, but did your headset get unplugged or something?
here.
Yes, much better now. Yes.
Oh, I hit that by mistake. If you go to traveling to abroad and you want to exchange your money, they have this listing of all the different currencies. Now, almost half of all currency exchanges around the world involve one currency, some other foreign currency against the dollar. It's 80% of the world foreign exchange of currencies takes place using it's one country exchanging money against the dollar, which shows again the overwhelming dominance of the US dollar in the US economy and the world economic system. Another thing these are 5 things that show why the US dollar is so dominant. That the first one was most international trade takes place in the dollar. Second is that most foreign central banks holdings are in the dollar, not in their own currency or some other currency. The 2/3 of international debt is made and must be paid back in dollars. That most foreign exchange trading is in one currency against the dollar. And the last thing is that most foreign currencies peg their currency after countries no longer pegged to the price of gold. They're pegged to well, some countries are pegged to the dollar. Other countries keep their currency in some kind of close relation with the dollar. 80% of the countries in the world do that. So the US dollar dominates the world economic system. And that's something, and that also means like the amount of quantity, the quantity of dollars that the US puts into circulation is going to shape to varying degrees the monetary policy of other countries around the world. Now this is the background for why the US can keep printing money and not not suffer a lot of inflation. And it shows what's wrong about modern monetary theory. It doesn't explain any of this, or just avoids explaining it. They just kind of, well, we just convince politicians to print more money, then we can have free healthcare for all and whatever we want, which is, I think the government knows that they can print all the money they want, but it all goes to basically to 1%. That's not an issue whenever they need to bail out these cannot fail so-called corporations. Now, the U.S. has been dominating the world since the end of World War II. And it's not just through the most important thing is through their military control over the world. They have 900 military bases around the world. They basically run the United Nations. They're in charge of the International Monetary Fund. They're in charge of the World Bank. The U.S. is the international currency. The U.S. controls the world's resources, particularly oil, which I didn't really realize this till I read about this, that after Nixon got off off gold, he made deals with Saudi Arabia and other countries to basically use, the petrodollar, the oil he made a deal that the U.S. will protect the governments like in Venezuela, Saudi Arabia, if they sell their oil in dollars, not in their own currency, and that they only sell their oil in dollars, which made guaranteed that the U.S. the dollar could still be the primary currency in the world. That if you didn't have dollars, you could not buy oil, and that was there are some countries that tried to sell oil without using the dollar. I think the first one was Saddam Hussein. And the second one, I think, was Muammar Gaddafi. And the third was, I think, Venezuela, just about 2 years ago. And now Iran is trying to do that. But you see what happens when the oil-producing country tries to get off using the dollar. The U.S. makes sure that they're overthrown. Even Russia still sells their oil in dollars to a large extent. Some of it they're not, but that just happened recently. So even though the U.S. has declined economically inside the standard of living, we have to recognize that the U.S. is just adjusted to that. It hasn't really hurt the country, their power of the U.S. empire. They've just adjusted how they rule the world. And their control of the world is still overwhelmingly dominant. As you can see, like how they can destroy Venezuela just by using sanctions, by blocking them from using the dollar. One thing that is interesting is that, maybe that a large part of the U.S. debt is in is held by foreign countries. I think 30% of the U.S. debt of 26 billion, and maybe it's a little more now, is held by foreign countries that they buy the U.S. debt, or they don't buy it. They loan the U.S. money to help. They loan the U.S. money and buy U.S. Treasury bonds, which gives the U.S. more money to buy stuff and help pay for everything that we have here. All the not just other rich countries, but poor countries. I get to that more in a minute. First, to get back to the role of the role of the dollar is going to play in the world market and how they are able to. What the U.S. does is basically export the inflation that printing all these dollars produces. That the U.S. remains the biggest consumer market in the world. That 1/4 of household production in the world is in the U.S. market. So third world countries need the U.S. market for their economic growth. The economies are based around mostly making cheap exports that get sent to the U.S. market. And we do have to, I didn't say it when I wrote this, but I should say when these countries got colonized by the Western countries restructured their whole economic system. So their whole economic systems were based on providing something to the so-called mother countries to help support their mother countries. They were restructured to make them dependent on the Western countries. And that still has remained the case. Even if they've had socialist revolutions, even like in Cuba, it's still a large extent dependent upon the Western countries for its economic growth. It still has to sell in the world market controlled by the Western countries. Now, when the U.S. Prints quantities of dollars like $10 trillion in the last 10 years, though it's probably more than that now, all these dollars go abroad. The foreign loans are made to foreign countries and to foreign corporations. U.S. companies make investments in companies overseas, or U.S. corporations buy companies in other countries, and the U.S. population have more money to go buy things that we want. So there's more importation of goods from other countries for the U.S. market. So U.S. prints trillions of dollars, and this money, a lot of it flows overseas to other countries to buy stuff. And this money that's printed is not backed by any increase in domestic production, which no other country can do that kind of thing without suffering the consequences. So what happens is that the value of dollar around the world goes down as the U.S. prints more dollars. And then when the dollar drops in purchasing power, the dollar price of commodities in the world market will go up. So that causes some inflation abroad. If you want me to go over that a little, I should say, if there's more dollars printed, then you're going to have to spend, the value of the dollar starts to go down, so you have to spend more money to buy the same thing, which means the dollar price of its things are going to go up in the world market. And so if other countries want to buy goods from the United States, now they got to pay more of their money to buy the same thing because the U.S. dollar price has gone up. This starts to cause inflation in these other countries and they have to do something about it. So their currencies will start to rise relative to the dollar. And when that happens, like especially with third world countries, that means the price of their goods they export to the US would start to go up in the US market, which means it would hurt their sales. And so what they do is have their own central banks in their country buy up the dollars that are in their economies and print more of their money to buy it up. And what that does is cause inflation in their countries. And then they sell the goods at the same price it used to be back to the United States, more or less, to make it simple. So they have to, if they don't start buying up dollars and printing their own money, it hurts their export industries. So they do have to start printing them, unless they can tolerate that. Maybe a country like Canada or Japan could tolerate that, but not, say, some country in Central America or Africa. So when they print their own money, this lowers the dollar price of their goods that are exported to the US. And this helps to limit the price increases in the US, but it pushes up inflation in their own countries. So what happens when the US is prints a lot of dollars and it gets sent around the world is that workers in other countries start producing more for less, while those holding dollars get more for less money. Uh, so what happens is that the US prints money and it is able to start importing things that reduce cost, because other countries got to eat up the extra dollars in their markets to maintain some stability in their market. So that US prints dollars, it ends up benefiting the US consumer, but it doesn't, it hurts the consumers in other countries because they got to pay more now. No, we not so affected by that. It's like the head of the JP Morgan Chase Bank said, the head economist of a commercial banking said last year, said when foreign banks stockpile dollars, they are effectively pushing up the purchasing power of American consumers. And so that's, I'll come back to that in a minute, but I want to go over like how the US controls third world countries and makes them stuck in their situation they're in. They're trapped. The third world countries are dependent on the third world market and the dollar because they lack basic requirements of sovereignty, whether you want to call it national sovereignty or the requirements of what modern monetary theory calls sovereignty. They don't have basic food self-sufficiency. They did before they got colonized, but after colonization, their economies were distorted, so they were producing for the Western countries. They lack food self-sufficiency, they lack energy independence, and they lack technological and industrial development. And for all these things, they have to import these things. And they have to import these things, all these goods, not with their own currency, but with the currency's so-called hard currency, which means the currency of the imperialist countries. And they cannot borrow in their own currency. They have to borrow in the currency of the imperialist powers. So they have to keep borrowing dollars or euros, and they have to pay back in dollars and euros, and they get stuck in this debt trap. And one thing that the World Bank has done, as Michael Hudson pointed out, is that it pushed countries around the world to become dependent upon American agriculture, like American wheat. A lot of countries are now, one of the causes of the Arab Spring was the rising price of imported wheat, and they raised the cost of living of people so much there that they started to protest. But one thing the World Bank did was to give loans to develop the agricultural goods that would plantation crops that would be exported to the U.S. And they did that at the expense of their own food self-sufficiency, which you can see that like Venezuela is not all food self-sufficient. It used to be food self-sufficient, but once it was told to rely on oil, it started importing all their food. Cuba they basically were encouraged just to make coffee, sugar, and tobacco. And now they have to import a lot of their food. They're trying to get out of it. It's not very easy. So these third world countries, they run up debts to pay for their imports of food and energy, and for loans to start industrializing. And so they have to subsidize their own export industries to gain the dollars they need to start paying for their debts and for their imports. And that distorts their economic modernization and national independence, for they are not really developing their own economy for themselves. They're developing their own economy to get the dollars to pay back what they owe, or to borrow dollars so they can try to borrow dollars to develop their economies a way that the Western banks and the World Bank and IMF tell them they need to develop their economy. Now, this results in a great outflow of wealth from third world countries to the United States. One modern monetary theory economist is Fadel Kaboub. He's their leading economist writing about modern monetary theory in the third world. He said that because of the system that the US has set up and the lack of sovereignty that third world countries have, that they send $600 billion every year from the third world goes to the first world. He said that's been true for at least the last 20 years. 600 billion a year gets sucked out of these countries to the first world through the dollar system and the banking system that is set up. So to go over a little more how for me, when I was reading it, it was confusing. Writing it down, I can maybe saying it without reading it is also, I have to, how this works is that the U.S. prints a lot of money. A lot of it will go over extra money and prints dollars not backed by increased in production. A lot of these dollars go overseas to buy things. The foreign central banks have to collect these dollars, and they do that by printing their own money and exchanging their money for the dollars that people in their country own. And they use these dollars not just to pay off their own debts, their own foreign debts of these governments, but they're also pressured to use these dollars they've collected to make loans to the U.S. to buy U.S. Treasury bonds. One good example is like Saudi Arabia. They were told that they sell all their money and they sell all their oil in dollars. The U.S. will protect their government militarily from being overthrown, and all the, maybe not all, but most of the accumulated wealth they get from their oil, they can either make contracts with U.S. corporations to build and important things, or they can buy U.S. Treasury bonds with their surplus dollars. And they are basically threatened that this is what they had to do. But other countries third world countries are driven to make loans to the U.S. to invest their money. They keep their foreign reserves in dollars, which means they keep their foreign reserves in U.S. Treasury bonds, which means they are loaning their money to the United States. So the foreign central banks collect the money that the U.S. has printed, and they buy U.S. Treasury bonds and loan money to the U.S. Treasuries, which helps to maintain their own currency's exchange rate with the dollar. And it also enables the U.S. to keep buying more and more goods from other countries. So you basically have other countries lending their money that the U.S. has printed, that they've been in their economies, lending those dollars back to the U.S. to fund the U.S. debt. Now, it doesn't cause inflation, that all this money that goes to their countries and then comes back to the U.S. doesn't really cause much inflation here, because the money is put in treasury bonds, so they're taken out of circulation. And money that's not circulating doesn't cause inflation. It's like money that you keep under your bed. It's out of the system. So when the U.S. prints all this money, it causes inflation overseas, but it doesn't really cause much inflation here. So what we have is that basically other countries, third world countries and other Western European countries, their investments or their loans to the U.S. to Treasury maintains the value of the U.S. dollar. And they're making loans to the U.S. Treasury that the U.S. cannot repay. I mean, I think everybody knows that the U.S. cannot repay this $26 trillion debt. So as I don't know if many of you had read Michael Hudson, he makes some useful states some useful things. The best one I thought was when Max Blumenthal and Ben Norton interviewed him for that Moderate Rebels. Michael Hudson tends to make some overstate things of certain amount, but he kind of summarized it in this overstated way of how the U.S. operates. He says the role of the dollar as the international currency. He said, let's suppose that you go to a grocery store and you buy food and then sign an IOU for everything that you buy. Then you go to a liquor store, you do an IOU. You buy a car, IOU. You get everything you want just for an IOU. But when people try to collect the IOUs, you say that IOU isn't for collecting from me. Trade it among yourselves. Think of it as your savings, as and trade it among yourselves. Treat it as an asset, just like you treat a dollar bill saved in a cookie jar and not spent. Well, then the people here in the U.S., you get a free ride. You're allowed to go and write IOUs for everything, and nobody could ever collect. That's the position that the United States has, and it's just what it wants to keep. That's somewhat overstated, but a lot of that is true. I don't know if I explained this all that well. But what we have here is a system where, I mean, if you went to the second article I wrote, I do explain it. It's easier sometimes if you're not that familiar, even I'm not that familiar, to read it and read a couple times over, and then you're like, oh. What we have is that since the U.S. is the world's reserves currency, it is not subject to the same rules that other countries have. It can spend more than it produces and maintain its consumerist lifestyle simply by printing more dollars. And we see that. And I think that modern monetary theory sort of tries to explain it. It doesn't, but I think this does, that I've read from different articles I was reading for this. Now, the problem is that for other countries to want to get, other countries know this is a scam. Even back, I read in 1971, the Europeans were complaining about this operation of the dollar when the Treasury Secretary just said it's, back then told the European bankers, the dollar is our currency, but it's your problem. Now, to go over what I think I learned from this, that reading about this, that should go over, make some conclusion about this, is that the economic power of, first thing is economic power of China is greatly overestimated. It has nowhere near the economic power of the United States in the world. Just because it's producing more stuff doesn't give it more economic power. It's not even, it's not close. The second thing is that other countries are been trapped into economic dependence on the U.S. and they can't just decide. They can't decide, well, we don't want to use the dollar anymore. They can't do that. I mean, third world countries, they get overthrown. They try to do that. And if all the Western countries were, China would say, okay, we're not going to use the dollar anymore, then their economies would go down the tank too. So it's, what's going to happen in the future, I don't know. But it's not an easy thing to try to get out of. The third thing I'd say is that the dollar's world control subsidizes our own standard of living. We live so well because we produce dollars without producing anything that backs up the dollar, and with other people just got to eat it up, people in other countries. A fourth thing, it shows what power the U.S. has to use economic sanctions to destroy other countries, which is, I think, one good thing about, well, it's not a good thing, but one thing that Trump showed is that you don't need to use military invasion to destroy a country. You can use sanctions to destroy a country just as effectively. And you can use sanctions on countries, and the U.S. people don't really know about it. The fifth thing I would say is that, speaking of the decline of the U.S. empire, is very premature. It's declining in some things, but it's very premature to say that it's, on the way out. It would be like saying, as I said, I think we were talking to Roger, it's like Roman Empire started to decline after the reign of Augustus in about 20 AD, but it was around for another 450 years, more or less. So, and so those are might be easier if I go to question and answer now. If people have questions, I can try to explain things better. I think I'm out of time anyways, or did I go over?
You're fine, Stan. Thank you very much. a lot for us to think about. The United States, far from being the productive member of the world community, is really the parasite on the world community. And while we kind of digest some of those things that you've given us to think about, I'm going to ask for a few announcements and then we'll go to question and answer. So, Gene, would you like to tell us about next week's program?
I would, and this was excellent. You know, Mark says somewhere that workers are going to need to master the intricacies of international trade and international relations. And I think that's very true. And I think one way they can do this is by listening to Stan Smith here and the talk he just gave, which we're going to post on our website, YouTube channel, ICSS Marxist, hopefully very soon. So again, thank you very much. I think this is, and I'm sure we all have lots of questions. To note next week, I get next week, I'll be talking about, socialism in the 21st century, the chances of socialism actually taking care of, taking control of this international system, overthrowing capitalism and establishing socialism. So that's what I'll be talking about next week, because Stan was sort of gloomy about that and prospects of overthrowing the system. And it's not a good thing to think about. It's going to last 400 years, and I don't think that's the case. So anyway, that's what we'll do next week. And we're very frugal as an institution here, but we do need some money. And I hope Richard is prepared to address that issue. Or maybe he can.
Yes.
Oh, good.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, yeah, we do need some funds for our regular work and to support the library. Unfortunately, we still taking it only in dollars, although I think we could take it, accept contributions in gold or something else, but we'd have a hard time. The gold we could handle, but the other currencies. The easiest way, for me at least, is to get the money through PayPal, but you can also send a check and even cash. I'll put it in the chat, but the instructions on how to do that. But you can also see the instructions on the email from Gene announcing the meeting, and also on our website. So I hope some people have been very generous, and I want to thank them and urge everybody else to be equally generous. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Richard. So now we'll have the question and answer. To get on the stack, either go into the participant box and raise your hand, or raise your hand physically, though I can't see everybody on the screen view, so I might miss you. Failing that, send me a chat and raise your hand. So right now on the stack is Sharon Rose, followed by Norma Harrison, followed by Larry, followed by Gene, and let me see if and followed by Mark Albertson, and I think what we'll do on the chat, because this is on the Q&A, because this is a fairly complex subject, we're going to ask to limit your comments or questions to just about 2 minutes, and ask Stan to respond to each question individually so that there's more of a dynamic Q&A interchange. So Sharon, if you could unmute yourself and and speak. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Stan. This was really great. I have two questions that are related. So my two questions are, what should the position of the US working class be? And what should the position of China as the leading leader of non-aligned and socialist nations. So the Chinese working class and others around the world, as you described, is propping up our way of life. And the relationship of the US working class to the international proletariat is one of being an aristocracy, relatively speaking. So what would be a progressive position for the US working class to take internationally? And then, although you pointed out that people too glibly say how powerful China is, and they're not nearly as powerful as some people think, they do have a lot of power. And one thing is that they hold a lot of US debt, as you described very well. So they have power, that represents power. They also have been doing things recently that appear to be efforts to erode or cut into the economic power of the United States. The latest thing being the new trade alliance that they just recently established. And I haven't looked into it, but it seems like to me, from reading the New York Times, that it's an effort to wrest some of that, to counter some of that dependency of countries around the world on the United States, as you described.
That's 2 minutes.
And so all of that boils down to two questions: what's a progressive position for the U.S. working class, and what should China be doing?
On the first part, I'm not sure what to, in terms of what I said here today. I guess the most important practical thing would be to explain to American working people why they should oppose all forms of US sanctions on other countries. Because that's warfare without looking like warfare. And to explain that well, you have to explain to people the power that the US economy has in the world. Like, I remember I used to work for years on opposition to freedom the Cuban Five and opposition to the US blockade. And I would hear all the time, well, the Cubans always blame everything on the blockade. They blame all their economic problems on the blockade. But if you see the role that the dollar has in the world economy, how they can basically totally isolate somebody, some country, and destroy them, then you see that why working people, in terms of international solidarity, should be opposed to war forms of sanctions. But it's not so obvious. But it's like the person who had the control to the switch that turned off the electricity to your house that you never think about. If they controlled that switch to shut off the electricity to your house, your life that'd be the end. I mean, you would be a total disaster. You couldn't operate. Well, you'd find some way after a long period of time, but that's basically the power of the dollar in the world economy. It's like some guy who controls the electricity to your house, and they can turn it off and on when they want. That's basically all I can say about that quickly. About China, I think reading about what countries have actually stood up to imperialism and actually built an economic system and raised the level of standard of living of the people in their countries See, the only two countries that have done that in a sustained way were the Soviet Union and China, but Soviet Union collapsed. China today is building a alternative that is sometimes their standard of living looks superior to what we have here. There's no other country that the U.S. is trying to overthrow, that the U.S. sees as an enemy. They're no way in any way independent. Cuba, I mean, not independent economically. They're not economically self-sustaining, independent, fully independent developing countries outside of the control of the United States. Cuba, Iran, Nicaragua, so on, you want to name it. Only China has been able to build an economic system that's the US, no matter what it tries to do, cannot disrupt it. That's the only real country in the world that's been able to, that can do that now. So that's an example for the world. Some people don't like the Chinese system, but even progressives, but that's still, they've built a system that the US cannot sabotage like it has with almost every other revolution that ever took place.
Okay, thank you, Stan. We have a long stack. I'm going to
Right.
read the stack just so that you know where you're at on that. The next person up is Norma Harrison, followed by Larry Orloff, then Eugene Ruyle, Mark Albertson, Johnson Choi, Peter Lubbs, and finally Yosef Gersey. And Norma, if you could unmute yourself and ask your question, please.
And Raj has his hand up.
Oh, Raj, too. Thank you.
Hi, it's nice to meet you, Mr. Smith. This discussion is illuminating what we need to know, what we need to deal with. I'm wondering whether a device, the public bank, if we worked to build public bank and maybe that would have currency for people so they'd start participating in it, with the example of, I guess it's North Dakota, having come through the 2008 event debt-free for themselves because they had a public bank and that's where they put their money instead of in some profit-making operation. The thing that was cited to me, I forget her name, the person that wrote The Deficit Myth, you might have seen it. We studied it in the strike debt group. Strike debt originally formed in order to try to counter the student loan indebtedness, which is so brutal. They haven't gotten very far except maybe to build up a certain amount of awareness. They the book pointed to World War II got funded by the US deficit. Congress just wrote the note, clicked the button, and there was the funding. And that was such a clear example of how that works. You say that that kind of funding, deficit funding, goes to the 1%. So what we need is somehow for people to be able to elect a government that will vote for funds for us so that we can fund our schools, or well, I don't mean schools, but I mean, healthcare and so forth through deficit funding, which doesn't cost us anything. And I'm grateful for Sharon's questions because the talk about where the large class of us needs to be, how it needs to see ourselves, is very important to begin to include in our attempts to revolutionize what goes on.
Oh, me?
Yeah.
Yes, Stan.
Okay.
If you want, the thing about public bank in particular, if anybody has any ideas.
I can't say that much about, I I've heard of the public bank in North Dakota. I imagine that a public bank outside of the control of the 1% would be, if it got to be big and effective, it would run into the same problems as countries do that try to get outside the control of the 1%. The rest of the US banking system would see it as a threat and would do what it could to destroy it. Yeah, but electing, you need basically a major social upsurge of some type in the US to change things. And I don't see that right now, but I'll try to keep my comments short. Okay.
Thank you, Stan. Up next is Larry Orloff, followed by Eugene Ruyle. So Larry, please unmute yourself.
Yeah, I have 5 questions. If the United States, the money goes to the top 1 or 0.1%, suppose they spread that out among the workers and paid workers a lot more money, wouldn't that lead to a lot of inflation in the United States, which we don't have because the working class doesn't get all that money to spend? Number 2, El Salvador uses dollars. They don't use their local currency. So are they outside of this description your description? Number 3, suppose China would sell all its US treasuries. I think they have like $1 trillion. I know that would damage China, but would that really ruin the United States, or how would that happen? I don't know if you can speculate on that. Number 4, what's the name of that bank or procedure where all the checks have to go through, all the loans? I'm not sure if they go through the central authority, which the United States.
Swift.
Yes, I think Swift.
I'm sorry?
Swift.
Swift, yeah. And can you describe how that works? And the last one is, it doesn't regard to you, but is there any way to donate books to the Marxist Library?
Okay. I'm not an economist, so I'm limited in what I can say. I guess I don't know what would happen if all the money that what the 1% got was spread among the population. That you wouldn't need that much money to raise their standard of living. If it would cause inflation, I don't know. But it's not just printing money. We should remember, it's not really printing. They just make it type it in on a computer. It's how much money circulates. If I calculate and print a bunch of money on a computer and it just sits in a bank, it's not circulating, so it's not really causing inflation. But if it's being spent, and that help cause inflation more. But I can't answer your question about that. But the second question about El Salvador, there are several countries that use dollars. I think
Panama,
Ecuador is one.
Panama and Ecuador, yeah.
And yeah, they're part of the system. They're dependent upon the price of the dollar. Their currencies. Oh no, actually, when you're talking about inflation and that kind of thing, and talked about in that second article I wrote, I don't know how to answer that question. But I know when I've been to Ecuador that the price of things in dollars in Ecuador is lower than the price of things in dollars here. If China sold its treasuries, then the value of the US dollar would go down and the price of Chinese exports would go up, and their economy would go into economic downturn. The way China could get out of it is if their internal market was so big, they could compensate for that by their internal consumption, which now their internal market is getting pretty big. I think their middle class now, they say, is 300 million people. It's like a lot of these companies like Huawei, it's still the #1 selling phone company, I think, in terms of the phones because of their huge internal market. So sanctions on Huawei are not hurting them too much. About SWIFT, all I know is that what I know about it is that what they were saying, one economist gave, if Japan sells cars to South Korea, they both have to convert their currencies to dollars, and then they make the sale, and then they convert it back to their own money. And any time anything is converted to dollars, it goes through the SWIFT system. So they keep track of everything. It's like Snowden talking about the NSA and all our emails. SWIFT system keeps track of every transaction made that is connected in some way with the dollar, and most transactions around the world are. In that way, it can monitor every single sale, like of a Cuban good, to some other country. If it's somewhere along the line, it uses a dollar. It gives it, it's like a big spy system on the world economic system. So that's those 4 questions of what I can answer quickly.
Yes, and Sharon Rose put in the chat that the library is not accepting books at this time. And I think if you have further questions on that, just use the chat and speak to Sharon Rose. The next person up on the stack is Eugene Ruyle, followed by Mark Albison. So Gene, it's all yours.
Okay, yeah, great. And this has been very good for me. And I just want to comment a couple of things. First of all, on what Sharon remarked about that institution is the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Plan that China has put forth. And as it happens, one of the founders of the institute, who we all know as Jiwan, and other people know him as KJ No, has spoken on this and has done some work on this. And I can put, he has a program, I think it's on By Any Means Necessary, or the ones that are run by Answer. But at any rate, I'll put that reference for you in the in the chat, so you can take a look at that, because he has a lot to say about it and helps clarify that. But there's still lots of questions that remain on that. And personally, as a member of the former member of the Peace and Freedom Party, our platform always said, tax the rich, not do any kind of financial finagling, just take the money away from the rich. They didn't earn it, they don't deserve it. And that's what we need to do from a political standpoint, in my view. And I have another question about the relationship between theory, modern monetary theory, and the labor theory of value. Personally, I am a labor theory of value man, and it's one of my favorite topics. And I'm wondering how this fits together. And I don't know if you want to address that now or at some future point, but it's something I'm very interested in as an intellectual, not so, and I think it's important for activists also. Anyway, that's all. Thanks.
Well, that's one thing I did my economics background is that when I did my master's thesis, I did it on the development of labor theory of value in Smith, Ricardo, and Marx. So I have some knowledge in that. I don't think MMT doesn't try to explain. It's not really true to call MMT a theory, because there isn't any theory. It's just like, if you have a sovereign currency, you can print all the money you want as long as there's not full employment and full production of all resources in the country. And that's basically, I mean, that's not a theory. That's just like a couple statements. So they don't try to explain labor theory of value. They like, what's the value of money? They don't. It's not the value of money, but what's the value? Labor value? They don't. It's not something they discuss. It's like fluff to them.
Okay, thank you. Next up is Mark Albertson, followed by Johnson Choi. So Mark.
Yeah, Stan, I enjoyed your talk very much. I do historical research at a military magazine. So when I try to understand what the military is doing with the money, it's interesting. But going back to what you intimated before about Saddam, yeah, in 2000 he took Iraq's oil transactions off the buck and put them on the euro. Now it's interesting what you said, because a month after we occupied Iraq in April 2003. We took Iraq's oil transactions off the euro and put them back on the buck. And one more point, in 1945, when the British were done, I mean, that war helped kill them. The British Empire is going to collapse. They came to us and wanted $3.7 billion. They came here hat in hand. I mean, that doesn't sound like a lot of money today. It was then. And we told them, yeah, we will help you. But $930 million that has to be spent in the United States or no deal. We also told them all their imports had to be paid in either dollars or gold or no deal. And if you're going to go to some of your Commonwealth countries for assistance, guess what? Our deal is off. So in 1945, we're already using the dollar as a bludgeon.
Mm-hmm.
So what you're saying today is a point well taken. Your thoughts, if you have any on this.
Well, I had read, I didn't include it, but it's in that article I wrote. It said that 1945, 3/4 of the gold in the world were in U.S. inside the U.S. in U.S.
$29
banks.
billion of it, right?
So basically, our dollar was as good as gold, and
right.
U.S. controlled the world. They just said that international currency is going to be the dollar. We're telling you that, and you don't like it. That's too bad. That's what it is. That's the deal.
Right. Right. So why spend soldiers when you can spend the dollar?
Why spend? I don't know what you mean.
Well, why spend blood when you can spend the paper? That's basically what you've been doing for the most part. You're printing money and using the dollar as a soldier.
Right. But they do need to enforce its rule.
Oh,
someone gets out of line, you destroy them.
Correct.
Militarily. And I guess like that economic hitman book also talks about that some.
Right. But the dollar is also a soldier. That comes in the form of sanctions.
Yeah. Yeah, not only sanctions, yeah. If you got to sell all your products in terms of the dollar, and you're some country, you're dependent upon the United States.
Right.
And you're stuck there. And if you try to sell it without using the dollar, the U.S. is going to go after you. And if you're a little country, they'll try to overthrow you.
Right.
Okay, thank you. Next up on the stack is Johnson Choi, but let me go through the stack so you folks can know where you are on the stack and if you're on the stack. Afterward is Peter Lubbs, Joseph Gersey, Raj Sahai, and Alvin Jha. So Johnson, if you
Roger, I think Peter left. He had to go.
Okay. So and then in any case, Johnson Choi, please.
I have two questions on China. China has been a cashless society for a while, basically using WeChat and Alipay inside China. And now China government is pushing into digital currency, which is by the China Central Bank. And I want you have a comment on that. The second question is, I read somewhere that people have been complaining about China spending a lot of money on Africa and the One Belt Road. And a lot of loan, and they said, how come you don't spend those money, the US dollar, on the poor region of China? And the comment was, China does not want to spend the US dollar in China. They want to spend the US dollar on One Belt, One Road in Africa. Because anything goes wrong, they say you go after the US, not China. Can I get a comment on the both questions?
It's out of what I was talking about, but I went to China last year, and I can say that, yeah, you want to buy everything in China, you use your phone. That's how you buy stuff in China. Even people on the streets, like selling, like here, selling ice cream on the street that we see, people walking with a cart selling ice cream, you buy it by using your phone. They have that little black thing on the phone and that comes up and that's your account, and you don't use money, you use your phone. I remember I tried to use my credit card in China, and it's like, we don't have anything set up for that. It's like you either got to pay cash or you got to use your phone, and everybody uses their phones. So I guess that's all digital. It's like way beyond the US where there's no credit cards, which also makes me think, well, China's got no credit card, so there's no debt, credit card debt like in this country. About spending the Belt and Road in the poor regions of China, I don't really want to go into it much, but I just read an article in the Wall Street Journal like 2 or 3 days ago, which is how Xi Jinping is prioritizing raising the standard of living in the countryside. He said we've raised the standard of living in the cities considerably, but we still have to raise the standard of living in the countryside, and they're investing $80 billion in building better schools and better housing and infrastructure in the countryside. So he's making it a big priority now because his plan is to eliminate poverty by 2021. And I think he seems to be able to do what he sets out to do. So.
Stan, 2021 is next year.
Yeah. Uh-huh. I remember it's like, what, 4 or 5 years ago, they had lifted 800 million people out of poverty. Now I think they have like 40 or 50 million left that they want to raise out of poverty. Extreme poverty, I assume. I'm not sure how they calculate that. But there's a big long article in the Wall Street Journal a couple of days ago about Chinese investments in the countryside. Okay.
Okay. And then there was a second question about Africa. Did you want to comment on that? That United States, China is investing in Africa instead of, and what does that mean by spending US dollars in Africa?
I'm not really sure I understand that.
Well, China has a lot of reserve US dollar, over $1 trillion.
Uh-huh.
But China is using, all this export they sell to US, they're getting all the US dollar coming in because of the surplus. And China doesn't want to use the US dollar surplus, the US dollar I'm talking about, in the domestic spending. They want to use this US dollar to spend on the One Belt, One Road countries and Africa. And there's a justification to do that, not doing that in China, but doing it outside China. Have you heard about that?
No, not about that, no, but I know about their One Belt, One Road and what they're doing.
Okay, that's fine. No problem. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Next up is Joseph.
Thank you. One quick comment, well, 2 quick comments and a question. Actually, many diplomats have objected to the use of sanctions to this measures done by the US. The sanctions should be legal sanctions. International recognized sanctions are done by the UN Security Council. They call them unilateral economic measures. Number 2, yes, actually, CPUSA slogan in Connect has been tax the rich, and we succeeded in instituting a millionaire's tax. Okay, my question is, China and Russia and sometimes other countries, major countries, have made sort of blocks, trading blocks and trading agreements in which the transactions will be done in like rubles and yuan rather than dollars, or rubles, yuan, and sometimes something else. So could you comment on that?
Was that two questions or one? I forget.
Well, actually, it's one that China
About the trade.
And Russia have set up small trading blocks or trading bilateral.
Right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I had read something about that about 4 months ago, I guess, when I was Googling about China and the economy and so on, when I was doing these two articles. And it said that China and Russia are getting off the dollar as international trade. So I read the article, but it was exaggeration. What it said was that trade between China and Russia, just between those two countries, was no longer going to be predominantly in the dollar. It was the trade between China and Russia was now only 50% dollar, maybe 52 or 40. I forget which the proportion was. 48 to 52% were not in dollar and were in dollar. So it's like, wow, if even China and Russia are trading in spite of all the sanctions and so on that the US puts on those two countries, or tariffs and sanctions, their trade with each other is still predominantly in the dollar, and they're just moving off of that slowly. It's like, that really shows the power of the US dollar in the world system. So they're a long, long way from getting off the dollar. I mean, what else I read? It was in articles I wrote about Chinese trade with Latin America and US trade with Latin America. And it's like Chinese trade with Latin America is now about half of what total US trade is with Latin America. But some 90 something percent of Chinese trade with Latin America takes place in the dollar. So they're a long way from getting off the dollar.
Nevertheless, it's a positive development.
Oh yeah, it's a positive development, but it's like one of these things is like, yeah, the US is declining, other countries are getting off the dollar, but it's very exaggerated. It's a lot of wishful thinking. Just like we're getting nowadays with wishful thinking about all the marvelous things Biden's going to do, I guess. But
Okay, thank you. Up next is Raj Sahai and Alvin Jha. And if there's anybody else who wants to speak who hasn't yet spoke, please raise your hand.
Oh, we're at the end of the list?
We're getting close. I think
still got half an hour. Okay.
Yeah. But no, there'll be more.
I was trying to hurry through. Okay.
So Raj, you're up now. Raj?
Yeah, Stan, thank you very much for your great presentation in terms of clarity and your thoughts, but I have some difficulty with it. I'll tell you what the difficulty is. If you could rule with a stick and borrowing money from people you can beat, then feudalism wouldn't have collapsed. Okay, the feudal empires collapsed because they borrowed money. They still had the guns, etc. They collapsed. The British Empire would not have collapsed, right? British Empire collapsed too. They had to become, by 1920s, they were in debt. Second World War knocked them out. So let's talk about the American empire. American empire is in trouble. You're saying the whole world gives us cheap goods and our standard of living is high. But if the standard of living is so high, why is half the people in the United States cannot make it today? Okay, so I think the problem is this is a phenomenology of late capital that makes it appear like people are happy, but they're not. They're in deep trouble. They're indebted. They can't send kids to school, college, can't provide for enough food. This is a country that you think is benefiting from all this. Now, if it's this very small class that benefiting so much, then why wouldn't they have a social peace like Lyndon Johnson's time and share the pie? So I think this whole presentation of yours, at least I could be wrong, but it sort of goes against Marx's thesis. The contradiction of capital in its late stage is maturing. And you're saying 450 years, the empire, Roman Empire ruled after one emperor started, it's decline. Well, I don't think 450 years is, what I'm seeing is a very precipitous decline. Now, I could be wrong, but you cannot, the economics has its foundations. I don't mean bourgeois economics. Marxian economics has a solid foundation. And you cannot go on like this. They are going on. Small country like Venezuela and Cuba and other countries are greatly affected. Large countries are affected also. But if Russia and China were able to put half of their trade outside of dollar, that's a big change. They aren't able to do 100%. Yes, I agree. India-Russia trade is also now in rupee and ruble. I don't know what percentage, but it's a good part of it. So I think your presentation is pretty, leads me to think that you don't see the possibilities of this fall of this American empire, which I think is a sickness all over the world, okay? And to which, unfortunately, Chinese economy is integrated with. So they are basically helping each other out. In the United States, policies of sending money to China and China is going to capitalism has sustained this. Otherwise, imperialism probably would have been in much deeper trouble much earlier. So I think, but now it is reaching there. And so please comment on all this as you like. Thank you.
A little while ago, I watched some film about offshore banking, Cayman Islands, and so on, how Britain adjusted to losing its empire. And it said that they basically replaced the amount of money they were getting from, well, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't say that. I don't remember the figures, but the amount of money that the wealth that they lost from their colonial empire, they were now recouping with all these offshore banking things that they had set up, where it's like $80 trillion. So Britain's declining, but again, like the US rulers, they know how to adjust and find some other way to keep their system working. But that's another thing. But I don't say that the U.S. standard of living is higher now than it used to be. It is higher now than it would be without the role of the U.S. dollar to prop it up. If it wasn't, our standard of living would be much lower. It's like, look, like Trump, even though you're not supposed to say anything good about him, he gave out these checks last spring. $1,200 for a person. You could go shopping. You can go to the store and buy goods from this money that was just made up. And you're going to probably be buying goods that were made in other countries. and you're basically buying it, this time you're buying it for free because you didn't make that money. You just got this check that this government just made up this money and sent you a check, and you go shopping and you buy all this stuff with this made up money. And it's most of the stuff you buy is from other countries. That's part of the way this keeps our standard of living up. But our standard of living is going down a lot. But I think how much of it is due to economic decline and how much of it is due to lack of struggle among the population to demand more equal distribution of wealth in the 60s and so on. All these struggles brought all these new social programs, just like the so-called, the Great Society stuff. It redistributed wealth a fair amount. A fair amount. It's now the distribution of wealth is after 30 years of neoliberalism, and the unions are not doing that much, and they're shrinking, and social movements don't have much power, that the standard of living of people is declining. The government just cuts all these services, and people are not very effective at fighting back against it. I mean, now that both the Democrats and Republicans talk about cutting services, that's different from before. So a lot of this decline in the US standard of living is due also to the lack of political activism among the US population. It's not just economic decline. About the fall of the empire, well, I was just saying that when you say talking about decline, the Russia was, Rome was declining for like 400 years. So to say the US is declining, what's it mean really? It just, the US is declining, but where's it going to, where it is in this decline? The most important thing, I think, there's not going to be any change in the US empire unless there's a mass struggle to overthrow it and replace it with something else. Something can be declining for a long time, but if there's no social power to say, hey, we're going to replace what you got now with this system, which we don't see at all in the United States, then there's no counterforce to the US imperialism here. There's no counter program to, Bernie Sanders said a few things, but he didn't organize any movement, and he kind of compromised on a lot. But the US can be declining, but standard of living here can get worse. But if there's no movement to fight against it, then that decline it doesn't result in any, that's not a problem for them that run the country. And we also got to wonder, well, if the US empire is declining, well, then how come there haven't been any socialist revolutions in, 50 years? The last one was in Vietnam in the late 70s. Before that, it was Cuba in 1959. All the socialist revolutions that happened were basically in the first half of the 20th century. Second half of the century, 20th century, for the last 70 years, it's like nothing. So if the US is really in decline and they're losing power, then you would see this alternative, the socialist revolutions, but you don't see that. So we have to take that into account and say, well, why? There must be other factors going on. Even say that the socialism has been declining more because the whole Soviet bloc just collapsed. So, to have the fall of an empire, you have to have a movement, organized movement, conscious political movement that organizes people and gets them to fight to change it. Otherwise, it can just keep declining and conditions here just get worse and worse and worse. I hope that answers your question well enough.
We will have an open discussion at 12:30, so we can pursue that some more. But let me read the stack and then see if I got everybody. And I'm putting people who have not spoken previously ahead of people who've spoken previously. So the stack right now is Alvin Jha, Bill Doors, Richard Wright, Alan Miller, Eugene Ruyle, and Mark Albertson. Alvin, could you ask your question, please?
Actually, I wasn't going to speak, but I'll just say I want to thank Eugene and the library and Stan for doing this presentation. I think it's very important that we try to understand the idea about dollar primacy and economics. One thing I do appreciate is that things be talked about in a down-to-earth manner, because especially in terms of economics, it's pretty arcane. And I remember you said that Michael Hudson overstated that idea about how IOUs were being printed. But personally, as a regular person who doesn't have any economics type background, even though it's an overstatement, it's a useful comparison for regular folks. So I think in general, we need to talk to people on a down to earth level. Thank you for the program.
Okay, thank you, Alvin. Let's go on to Bill Doors, please.
Bill?
Hi, hello, can you hear me?
Yes, you're fine. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I mean, I think we're all for a mass upsurge, and it's got to be built. But it's still, I mean, this amazing machine the U.S. created going back to 1945, which I call the military financial complex, is an effort to manage the crisis of capitalism that they cannot escape from, no matter what, which is the basic contradiction between there's overproduction, and there's the monetary theorists. I'm not the people who promote MMT. Like one of them is Alexandra, is AOC, and she says, well, we can print all this money. Let's spend it on hospitals and housing and transportation, and not on the military. But that wouldn't work because the military spending is fundamental to propping this whole thing up. It has to be backed by something. The value of the dollar still has to be backed by something, and that something is the book value of the U.S. government, which is more than half military, and it enables the U.S. to spend. If the U.S. were to spend this stuff on things people can use, that would compete with that would drive down the value of capital as a whole. But this props up the value, but this huge military budget, which the rest of the world is subsidizing, props up the value of the dollar and of capital as a whole. And of course, to have an exchange value, you got to have a use value, and that use value is war, which is why we have one reason the state of permanent war is necessary. But
it's almost 2 minutes.
To keep this relationship going, the military is a fundamental aspect of it. And it's not the U.S. is producing so much less than it used to. It's the incredible leaps in the productivity of labor, which which means many fewer people are producing as much, and a lot of it is military spending. Is weapons of war which don't enter the market in the usual way. Finally, but I did notice an interesting, a very important statistic the other day that just shows the extent of the problem, but also the extent of decline. In 1995, it took $50 worth of Chinese labor to be exchanged for a dollar of 50 hours of the work of a Chinese worker to be exchanged for an hour of the work of a worker in the United States, due to the much higher productivity of labor here. This year, it's 7 hours to 1 hour, which is a huge gap, but a gap that's it's closing tremendously, and it's really the productivity of labor that is the crisis. The incredible growth of the productivity of labor is the cause of the crisis they're in constant battle against, which this is just a mechanism to try to suppress, and that they need to try to suppress the development of productive forces around the world.
Dan, would you care to comment on that? Or it sounded more like a statement, which was a good statement, but
Yeah.
do you have a comment on that?
No, I'd agree with what you say, yeah.
Okay, let's go on to Richard Wright and then followed by Alan Miller.
I think I'm unmuted.
Yes, you are.
Yeah, I guess I'm going to be the contrarian of the group here. Not something I'm not unused to. First off, I find it kind of peculiar that everybody's calling it monetary theory when this is basically something that I learned back in economics back 40, 50 years ago. It's not all that modern. In fact, it finds its roots in this sort of gets back to the answer to the question about division of labor, labor theory of value versus the Federal Reserve. Basically, this goes back to the Bretton Woods and setting up the United States as a reserve currency. So it's got nothing to do with labor theory of value. I find it really interesting that all of a sudden everybody is talking about the modern monetary theory, especially in the last 5, 10, maybe 15 years. And I think in large measure that's because of a lack of fiscal policy by our Congress. In point of fact, we've been deadlocked as far as spending on socially needed legislation. Modern Federal Reserve spending, if you will, does exactly the same thing as legislative spending. Basically, they make promises for money. They trade an IOU for future spending. What's not happened in the last 15 years is we have been roadblocked on the fiscal policy. And that's why you're seeing this rise towards a modern monetary theory, because there's no other way out of this thing. I mean, everything has now been turned over to the feds, and they are, and even the feds now are saying we need more fiscal policy, not more monetary policy. So, and I find this whole explanation of how this works, it's very short-sighted in the sense that the Fed doesn't just print money. What it does is that it gives money to certain chartered banks that are, and they restrict how much they can loan out. So it's not just a simple matter of printing money. I think what you're doing is conflating the petrodollars, which is a very real factor, with the Federal Reserve, which I think is a large measure being brought up by the stock market, the people that want to go back to a gold standard, and so they bring this up. They bring up the yield difference, and all basically an attempt to push up the price of gold. Okay, with that, I'll let it go. Thank you.
I don't have much to say about that. Yeah, modern monetary theory is it is not really that new. To me, it's kind of like a fad anyways. I expect it'll disappear. I mean, there's enough economists who say, yeah, we can print as much money as we want, or they don't actually print it, it's just type in a certain amount of money on the ledger of banks and say, this is your money, just go do with it, whatever. But the real problem that modern monetary doesn't address is like, once you make up all this money, who's going to benefit from it? And the way the system is set up now, the rich benefit from it. And it's going to stay that way unless there's a real struggle going on. But that's all I have to say about that.
Right. Okay, thank you, Stan. I'm seeing some hands up. I'm not sure if they're hands that haven't been lowered or if they're raised again. But right now, I'll tell you what the stack looks like from this point of view and make sure I haven't missed anybody, particularly anybody who hasn't yet spoken. I have Alan Miller next, Jean, Mark, Johnson, and Joseph in that order. So if I incorrectly put you on the stack, perhaps you could lower your hand. And if you want to be in the stack and you don't have your digital blue hand up already, please do so. Okay, so the next person is
I
Alan.
just took mine down.
Okay, thank you, Mark. So Alan Miller, please. We'll be timing you, by the way, Alan.
I can time myself, Roger.
You'll be timing yourself.
I have the timer right here. First of all, I just wanted to thank Stan for his presentation. I know he did a lot of work preparing and put a lot of time into researching his articles. I think I would really encourage everybody to read those articles. They are just chock full of information of great value to kind of put them aside if you're interested in looking at this question. I also want to make a comment that this is probably one of the liveliest sessions we've had in terms of the number of people who want to make comments. And I think that that's really speaks to the value of what we're talking about today and the presentation that Stan made. I just want to make a quick comment on sort of some of the ideas that have been brought up between Stan and Raj to try to put together some of the things that people are talking about. In my view, I think the value of what Stan has put forward is to show the dominance of the US, the degree of dominance, which a lot of people don't appreciate and understand, that it is in fact very strongly dominant in the international financial system. And there have been moves lately to supplant the dollar or to find a substitute. And they really have been very limited. I think Stan is accurate in his description of that. So things like the BRIC, trade between China and Russia. The thing that I would call attention to, I think Raj also makes a very good point in that there are these instabilities that are underneath the system. And I'll wrap this up very quickly. First of all, perhaps the thing that's going to knock the dollar out won't be sort of an alternative that sort of flowers out of nowhere, but the instability in the international financial system, which back in March was like a tremendous crisis that almost knocked the dollar off its feet here within the US. So I just wanted to make that statement that there's sort of a dialectic here.
Okay, let me say, someone had posted in the chat about Hudson. I think if that IOU quote I gave from Hudson, that is from the end of that second article I wrote. If he was really, if it was, it's exaggerated because he said it was like, basically it's all just IOUs not backed by anything. But if what he was saying was 100% accurate and not exaggerated, then the whole US debt would be owned by, or it would be based on loans from foreign countries to the United States. And that's not the case. That does not make up a lot of the US debt. It's only like 30 some percent. So there's other things going on that That's why I think sometimes he exaggerates. So I think I don't know how I explain it talking all this, but I think it's more clear when it's written out in those two articles I wrote. And I guess sorry, I didn't mean to disagree with what Raj was saying about imperialism and the labor theory of value and the collapse of capitalism, but I guess some of it is sort of from my background. I think the first time I ever read some socialist newspaper back in the mid 70s talked about the crisis of capitalism. But that's like 50 years ago now. They're talking about, they've already talking about the crisis of capitalism back then. And so doesn't seem like capitalism they seem to recover pretty well. So we have to keep that in mind when we're talking about I think some leftists try to wishful thinking that the U.S. is going to collapse anytime soon. I don't think so. Not unless there's a major struggle.
Okay, thank you. It's now 12:22, and we're going to close about 12:30. We're not going to necessarily close it at the minute, but close to that. And I wanted to give Stan a chance to summarize or make a final statement if he cares to. We'll have at least one more or two more questions. And then after that, our usual tradition is to stop the recording and just have an open session where people just speak without a moderator. And I think that Stan has grandfather duties afterward. So he might have to go see his daughter and his grandkids, but I think those of you who want to stick around, you're more than welcome to. In fact, we encourage that. So the next person on the stack is Eugene Ruyle.
Okay, well, thank you. I just want to second Alan's comments. I mean, this has really been a superlative thing. I think we need to get this out and will be posted very soon, I trust. I have two comments. One is on China and another on the labor theory of value. But, China, with its poverty reduction thing, according to the New York Times, the income of Chinese urban workers has quadrupled in the last 20 years. And even the poorest 10% of Chinese, their income has increased about 200%, according to the New York Times, which we know doesn't lie. So I just want to say, people are seeing the comparison here, and United States is not coming out all that well. And one of the political things that we're doing, I'm in Veterans for Peace, as people know, we have a program, called Pivot to Peace with China and the World. And, it's an uphill struggle to get this across, but it is a very important struggle. And the other thing I wanted to say is something that Paul Sweezy made about the importance of labor theory of value. It may seem like all these financial things is what's running the world, but he pointed out that every school child knows that society would stop within not weeks or months, but within days, hours, if labor started without labor. If we didn't have the buses running, the supermarkets going, all this, it's kept in motion by labor. And the labor theory value knows that and says, well, we need to look at the social relations there. We need to understand this in terms of relationships between people. I mean, this whole idea of these monetary things are great, and that does control a lot of things and it could be very predictive, but the basic thing is that the world is run by the working class, and according to certain social relationships, much of the wealth that is produced both by nature and by the workers is siphoned off. And the labor theory of value is crucial because it never lets us forget that very important point. So with that, I will back off. And
Thank you, Gene. And I see one more hand. So rather than going directly back to Stan, David Campbell hasn't spoken. So David, why don't you ask your question or make a comment?
Yes, very good. Thank you. I'm enjoying the conversation and presentation. The question is prompted by an earlier exchange and Stansfield's response, and that is the extent to which any country really, but our country in particular, America, represents an idea or a set of ideas or ideals. It's been referred to as a project. Of course, it's a pretty advanced project, and yet still open to quite a bit of change and innovation and evolution, for better or worse. So the question is, if America went away or were to go away or change significantly in the future, wouldn't there be another country that would arise and would serve the role much in the way that the United States as a collective play that role now? And that would be a role around extreme, I'm not defending it, just suggesting extreme power, unbridled and unchecked, apparently in some respects. Lack of consequences or apparent consequences that's suggested in the very theme topic of this presentation. So the question, if it were another country, if it were China, or let's say in the past or future, Russia, or what was the former Soviet Union, if it were the EU, either continuing to piece itself together and acting with greater uniformity, or some other country in the future on the rise, wouldn't there be a country or a power block that would present itself somewhat in the manner that the US has and does now? It's sort of long, but thank you. Appreciate it very much.
Stan, you're muted again.
I'm on now.
Yes, you were on. Thank you.
If it was a capitalist or imperialist country that took the place of the U.S., yeah, it wouldn't make much difference. But I don't think China today is a capitalist or imperialist country. I mean, it has a lot of capitalism, but it's still not. Capitalist class doesn't rule that country. They have a large role, but they're not in charge. And if China stayed that way, well, they would. It would be different if they got to be U.S. empire disappeared, and they kind of set the example.
Okay, Stan, do you want to make a final comment, or you commented out?
I think I said enough, yeah.
Okay, so we're just about at the half-past moment. I'm going to step out to get a bite to eat and then come back for the open discussion. But I think Bill Doors is up next, and Stan, you're dismissed if you wish, but we'd love for you to stick around for the open discussion. And thank you very much for a very informative and provocative discussion.
Institute for the Critical Study of Society at the Nebo Proctor Marxist Library receives no corporate funding, nor do we have any paid staff. We rely on the support of working class folks that share our commitment to the socialist legacy of Karl Marx. We continue to need funds to meet necessary expenses. Since we can no longer pass the hat at our in-person forums, please send contributions to our treasurer, either online via PayPal or by check. The PayPal ID is ICSS Sunday, SUNDAY, @yahoo.com, and the name is Richard Fallenbaum. and checks may be made out to Richard Fallenbaum and sent to him at 1225 Nielsen Street, Berkeley, California, 94706. Fallenbaum is spelled Fallenbaum. To donate directly to the Marxist Library, send a check to the Nebel Proctor Marxist Library at 6501 Telegraph Avenue, Oakland, California, 94609, or directly or donate online at www.paypal.me/npml. For information, write to npml at marxistlibr.org, and the website is marxistlibr.org.